The moment the lawyer stopped reading my father's will, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't know exactly what it was yet. At that point, I still believed the day would be simple, maybe uncomfortable, but predictable. My father, Robert Carter, had passed away 2 weeks earlier after a long illness, and that morning my sister Emily and I sat across from the family attorney in a quiet office in downtown Columbus, Ohio, waiting to hear what he had left behind. It was one of those gray Midwest mornings where the sky looks like it's made of concrete. The kind of day where everything feels heavier than it should. The lawyer's office smelled faintly like coffee and old paper, and the only sound in the room was the slow ticking of a clock on the wall. I remember watching that clock while Mr. Harris flipped through the pages of the document in front of him. At the time, I thought I was just nervous about hearing my father's final wishes. Looking back now, I think part of me already sensed something deeper was wrong. My name is Ryan Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until recently I believed I understood my family pretty well. But the truth is, families have a way of hiding things from each other. Sometimes for years. Sometimes until it's too late. My sister Emily sat to my left that morning, perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly on the table like she'd rehearsed the moment. Emily is 2 years younger than me, and growing up she always had this quiet confidence about her, like she knew how things would play out before anyone else did. Our mother, Linda, sat beside her, staring down at her purse the entire time. Losing my dad had been hard on all of us, but especially on her. For months before he passed, Emily had been the one living nearby, helping with doctor appointments and medications and all the things that come with caring for someone who's slowly fading away. I lived about 400 miles away in Nashville, working long hours managing a small logistics company, and although I visited whenever I could, I always had this quiet guilt in the back of my mind that Emily had carried more of the burden than I had. That was part of why I tried not to question things when she took charge after Dad died. She organized the funeral. She handled the paperwork. She talked with the lawyer. Honestly, I figured she was just doing what needed to be done. But there were small moments in the days after the funeral that started to bother me. At the time they seemed minor. Now they feel like warning signs I should have noticed earlier. One night after the service, while a few relatives were still sitting around the kitchen table drinking coffee, someone casually asked how Dad had arranged things financially. Emily answered before anyone else could speak. She said, Dad made some changes near the end. He wanted things handled a certain way. The way she said it stuck with me. Not emotional. Not uncertain. Just confident. Almost rehearsed. I remember asking, what kind of changes, and she just shrugged and said, you'll see when the lawyer reads it. At the time, that seemed reasonable enough. People update their wills all the time. Still, something about her tone made me uneasy. My father had always been very straightforward about that kind of thing. Over the years he'd told both of us more than once that whatever he had would be split evenly between his 2 kids. The house. The business. Everything. He'd said it so many times it felt almost like a family rule. So when Emily started hinting that things had changed, I told myself there was probably a logical explanation. Maybe Dad adjusted something for tax reasons. Maybe he made a small update about the business. Either way, I didn't expect anything dramatic. But sitting there in that office, watching the lawyer slowly review the document, I noticed something strange. Mr. Harris had known my father for nearly 20 years. He'd handled contracts for Dad's construction company and helped draft the will a long time ago. Usually he was calm and efficient, the kind of guy who moved through paperwork like a machine. That morning, though, he seemed different. He adjusted his glasses, scanned one page, then flipped back to the previous one. His eyebrows pulled together slightly. Then he cleared his throat. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a small pause. But in a quiet room like that, even a small pause feels loud. Emily leaned forward slightly in her chair. Is everything okay? She asked. Mr. Harris gave a polite smile and said, just making sure I'm reading the correct version. The correct version. I didn't think much of those words at the time. But looking back now, that was the first crack in the story that had been forming around us. Because what I didn't realize then was that the document sitting on that desk wasn't the same document my father had signed months earlier. And the person who knew that better than anyone else in the room, was my sister. At that moment, though, I just sat there watching the lawyer turn another page, wondering why a simple reading of my father's will suddenly felt like the beginning of something much bigger than any of us expected. After the lawyer made that small pause and then continued reading, the room slowly settled back into that same heavy silence. At the time, I told myself that I had probably imagined the tension. Lawyers pause all the time when they read documents. Maybe he was just double-checking a page number. Still, something about the way Emily sat in her chair caught my attention. She looked almost too calm. Her hands were folded neatly on the table, and she watched Mr. Harris with the kind of quiet focus that you normally see when someone already knows how a story ends. I remember thinking that maybe she had simply discussed more details with the lawyer than I had. After all, she had been the one handling most of the conversations during the weeks before Dad passed away. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses again and began reading the document from the top, explaining the standard legal language about the estate, the debts, and the responsibilities that come with settling everything properly. It was the kind of slow legal phrasing that most people tune out after a few minutes, but I forced myself to listen carefully. My father had spent his entire life building a small construction company from nothing. It was not some massive corporation, but it had supported our family for decades. He owned a modest house on 2 acres just outside the city, a couple of company trucks, and enough savings to make sure my mother would be comfortable. Growing up, Dad had always been very clear about one thing. He believed in fairness. When Emily and I were kids and argued over anything, from chores to borrowing the family car, his answer was always the same. Everything gets split down the middle. That was his rule. It was something he repeated so often that it almost became part of how I understood him as a person. That is why, sitting in that office, I expected the will to follow the same logic. Half to Emily. Half to me. Clean and simple. Mr. Harris continued reading through the formal parts of the document, and while he spoke I noticed Emily occasionally glancing at me from the corner of her eye. It was subtle, but it happened often enough that I started to wonder if she was watching my reaction. At one point our mother shifted in her seat and asked quietly how long the process usually took. Mr. Harris answered politely, explaining that reading the will was only the first step and that the estate settlement could take several months depending on how the assets were organized. Emily nodded as if she already understood all of this. In fact, she seemed almost impatient for the conversation to move forward. I had noticed that same energy from her during the days after the funeral. She had been very efficient about everything. She organized the paperwork, scheduled the meeting with the lawyer, and even started talking about what might happen to the business once things were finalized. One evening earlier that week we had been sitting at the kitchen table in my parents' house, the same place where we had eaten family dinners for most of our lives. Emily had been flipping through a folder of documents when she casually said something that stuck with me. She said, "Dad made a few decisions near the end that you might not expect." I remember asking her what she meant by that. She did not answer directly. Instead she said, "He just wanted to make sure the company stayed stable." At the time I assumed she was talking about the day-to-day operations of the business. Emily had worked with Dad during the last year when his health started declining. She helped manage invoices and coordinate projects when he was too tired to go out to job sites. From a practical perspective it made sense that she had become more involved. But the way she phrased it that night carried a tone that was hard to explain. It sounded less like a conversation and more like a quiet warning about something I had not yet heard. Sitting in the lawyer's office now, those words drifted back into my mind. I glanced at Emily again and noticed she was watching Mr. Harris closely as he turned each page. She did not look nervous. She looked prepared. That was the best way I can describe it now. Prepared. Meanwhile, I was still trying to piece together what exactly she had meant earlier in the week. Our mother remained quiet throughout most of the meeting. She had lost her husband of nearly 40 years, and the weight of that loss showed in the way she held herself. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table while the lawyer continued reading through the document. The ticking clock on the wall filled the gaps between his sentences. Finally, Mr. Harris reached the section that described the distribution of the estate. This was the part everyone had been waiting for, even if none of us wanted to admit it out loud. He cleared his throat slightly and looked down at the page again before continuing. As he read the opening lines of that section, Emily shifted forward in her chair just a little bit, like someone leaning closer to a television when the most important moment of a game is about to happen. I felt a strange knot form in my stomach. At that moment I could not explain why. But looking back now, I think that was the first time I truly sensed that the story Emily had been quietly building around our father's will might not match the reality we were about to hear. I remember the exact moment the tone in the room started to change, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet. Mr. Harris adjusted the papers again and began reading the portion of the will that described how my father wanted his estate divided. His voice stayed calm and professional, the same steady tone lawyers seem to practice over decades of reading documents like this. But before he could even finish the first paragraph of that section, Emily spoke. It was subtle, almost like she was helping move things along. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Dad wanted to make sure the company stayed stable after he passed." Her voice carried that same quiet confidence I had heard earlier in the week. Mr. Harris paused for half a second and then nodded. Politely, continuing to read. At the time I did not think much of her interruption, but now when I replay that moment in my head it feels different. It felt less like a comment and more like she was setting the stage for what everyone in that room was about to hear. The lawyer explained that my father's construction company, Carter Building Services, was considered the primary asset within the estate. It had been operating for almost 25 years, mostly doing residential remodeling and small commercial projects around the Columbus area. Dad built it from the ground up with one pickup truck and a set of tools he bought on credit. Over the years the company grew slowly but steadily. By the time he passed away it employed 8 full-time workers and had contracts lined up for months ahead. That business was more than just income to him. It was his life's work. As Mr. Harris described the structure of the estate, Emily nodded again like someone confirming information she already understood. Meanwhile I felt a strange tension building in my chest. Not panic exactly, just a growing sense that I was slightly out of step with whatever conversation was unfolding. Mr. Harris continued reading through the explanation of how the estate would be managed during the settlement process. He mentioned that an executor had been appointed to oversee everything while debts were paid and assets were transferred. When he said the name of the executor, Emily straightened in her chair. "Emily Carter has been named executor of the estate," the lawyer said calmly. Emily did not look surprised at all. In fact, she gave a small polite nod, the kind someone gives when a decision they expected has just been confirmed. I glanced over at her. "You already knew that?" I asked quietly. She turned to me with a calm expression. "Dad told me a few months ago he was thinking about it," she said. He wanted someone close by handling things. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. After all, I lived several states away. Still, I could not shake the feeling that I had missed several conversations that apparently happened without me. Mr. Harris kept reading. He explained the responsibilities of the executor, how Emily would oversee the financial accounts, coordinate with the bank, and manage the process of transferring ownership of company assets once everything was finalized. Emily listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the document in front of the lawyer like she was following along in her head. The more the meeting continued, the more I noticed something unusual about the rhythm of the conversation. Every time the lawyer reached a section related to the business or the property, Emily seemed to anticipate it before he even finished reading. At one point she said, almost casually, "Dad wanted to make sure the truck stayed with the company too." Mr. Harris looked down at the document again and nodded. "Yes, that is addressed in the following paragraph. The comment seemed harmless, but it planted another small question in my mind. How did she know exactly what was coming next in the document? Maybe Dad had simply told her the details before he passed. That would not have been impossible. But the way she said those things sounded less like remembering a conversation and more like confirming a script she had already memorized. My mother finally looked up from the table and asked quietly whether the house would remain in her name. Mr. Harris reassured her that the home would remain hers as long as she wished to live there. Emily reached over and gently placed her hand on Mom's arm as if to comfort her. It was a thoughtful gesture, but there was also something calculated about the timing of it. Almost like she was making sure everyone in the room saw her as the responsible one holding things together. As the reading continued, I found myself watching Emily more than I was listening to the lawyer. Every reaction she had seemed slightly ahead of the conversation. When Mr. Harris turned another page and began describing how the company ownership would transition, Emily quietly folded her hands together again, almost like someone bracing for the exact moment they had been waiting for. That was when the lawyer slowed down slightly and looked at the document again before speaking. The room felt suddenly smaller. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder. Mr. Harris began reading the lines that explained who would assume operational control of Carter Building Services once the estate settlement process was complete. Before he could finish the sentence, Emily spoke again, her voice calm but unmistakably certain. She said, "Dad believed I was the one who understood the business best." The way she said it carried an assumption that the rest of us had already accepted that idea. I remember looking at her then and realizing something I had not allowed myself to consider before. My sister was not just participating in this conversation. She was guiding it. And the more she spoke, the more it started to feel like she had been preparing everyone for a version of the will that I had never actually seen. The room stayed quiet after Emily said those words, but the atmosphere felt different now, like something invisible had shifted between us. Mr. Harris cleared his throat and continued reading from the document, but my attention had moved away from the legal language and onto the reactions around the table. Emily sat perfectly still again, almost satisfied, as if the most important part of the conversation had already begun unfolding exactly the way she expected. I remember leaning back slightly in my chair, trying to process what I had just heard. The lawyer continued explaining the details about operational control of Carter Building Services, using the careful wording that lawyers always seem to rely on. According to the document, the company would remain active during the estate settlement, and the executor would oversee its financial stability until the final ownership structure was transferred. Emily nodded again, listening closely. But before Mr. Harris could move on, she spoke once more, this time with a tone that carried just enough volume to draw everyone's attention. She said, "Dad always told me he wanted the company to stay in the hands of someone who understood how it worked." The comment hung in the air for a moment. I noticed my mother glance up from the table, her expression uncertain. Mr. Harris paused slightly but then continued reading the next lines of the document. The wording described how leadership decisions would be handled temporarily while the estate remained under review. As he read, I realized something uncomfortable. Emily was speaking as if the final outcome had already been decided, even though the lawyer had not yet finished explaining the structure of the will. That realization made the knot in my stomach tighten a little more. I tried to keep my voice calm when I spoke next. I asked, "Did Dad ever talk with you about how he wanted things divided?" Emily turned her head toward me slowly. There was no anger in her expression, but there was a certain firmness there that I had not seen before. She said, "Ryan, you were not here during the last year. Dad and I talked about the business almost every day." The sentence was simple, but it carried a quiet weight that everyone in the room seemed to feel. She was not raising her voice or accusing me of anything directly, yet the implication was clear enough. I had lived 400 miles away. She had been here. I noticed my mother shift slightly in her seat again, as if the conversation was becoming uncomfortable. Mr. Harris looked down at the document for a moment before continuing to read, clearly trying to keep the meeting focused on the legal process rather than family tensions. Still, Emily's words had already done their work. I felt a subtle pressure building in the room, the kind that appears when people begin forming quiet judgments without saying them out loud. The lawyer continued explaining the structure of the estate, but my attention was drifting again. I found myself replaying the past few weeks in my mind. Emily had been the one handling every conversation with the lawyer. She had organized the meeting today. She had also been the one telling relatives that Dad had made certain decisions near the end. Now, sitting here listening to her speak with such confidence about what Dad supposedly wanted, I realized something that had not fully registered before. She was slowly shaping how everyone in the room understood the situation. Mr. Harris eventually finished reading the section about temporary business management and looked up briefly from the document. Emily took that moment to speak again, this time addressing both the lawyer and the rest of us at the table. She said, "I know this is difficult for everyone, but Dad was very clear with me that he wanted the company protected. He believed stability was the most important thing." Her voice carried the tone of someone presenting a conclusion rather than asking a question. My mother nodded faintly, still looking tired and overwhelmed. I could see how easy it would be for someone in her position to accept the version of events Emily was describing. After all, Emily had been there every day during Dad's illness. She had helped manage the company paperwork. She had been the one speaking with contractors and suppliers while Dad was recovering from hospital visits. In many ways, it probably did look like she understood the business better than I did. But something about the way she spoke still did not sit right with me. It felt too certain, too carefully delivered. I looked back at Mr. Harris, expecting him to clarify the exact terms written in the will, but instead he simply nodded politely and turned another page. The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence again for a moment. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair now, her expression calm, almost relaxed. It was the expression of someone who believed the conversation had already moved in the direction she needed. And as I sat there watching her, a realization slowly started forming in my mind. My sister was not just responding to the reading of the will. She was guiding how everyone else interpreted it. The more she spoke, the more it sounded like the story of my father's final decisions had already been written somewhere before this meeting ever began. And for the first time since walking into that office, I began to wonder whether the version of the will sitting on that desk was really the same one my father had signed. Mr. Harris turned another page slowly, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the quiet slide of paper against the desk. I remember watching his hands very closely at that point, though I could not explain why. Something about the pace of the meeting had started to feel strange. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just slightly off in a way that was difficult to describe. The lawyer continued reading through the section about the estate structure, explaining how the financial accounts would remain temporarily frozen until the executor completed the required documentation. Emily listened carefully, nodding again as if each sentence simply confirmed something she had already expected to hear. My mother sat quietly beside her, still looking tired from the past few weeks. The loss of my father had clearly drained her, and I could see how easy it would be for her to let someone else handle the complicated decisions that came after a death in the family. Emily seemed to understand that very well. She spoke again before the lawyer could continue to the next page. Her tone was calm and reassuring, almost comforting. She said, "Dad talked with me a lot about how stressful these transitions can be for families. He really wanted to keep things simple so Mom would not have to worry about the business side of things." My mother nodded slowly, clearly appreciating the reassurance. I could see how the conversation was shifting now. Emily was positioning herself not only as the person who understood the company but also as the person protecting the family from unnecessary stress. It was subtle, but effective. I leaned forward slightly and asked Mr. Harris a question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the meeting started. I said, "When was the last time my father updated the will?" The lawyer looked up from the document and adjusted his glasses again. "According to the record in this file, the most recent revision was completed approximately 11 months before your father passed away," he explained. That answer immediately caught my attention. 11 months. I glanced over at Emily, expecting some reaction, but her expression stayed perfectly composed. Instead she simply said, "That sounds about right." Dad and I had several conversations about things around that time. The explanation seemed smooth, almost too smooth. I tried to remember exactly where I had been 11 months ago. At that point Dad had already started having health problems, but nothing that felt life-threatening yet. I had visited during Thanksgiving that year, and I distinctly remembered Dad talking about the company and joking about retirement. He never once mentioned making major changes to the will. Still, people do not always share those decisions with everyone. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Mr. Harris flipped to another page and began reading the section about documentation requirements for the executor. As he spoke, he reached into a folder beside him and pulled out a separate document. It appeared to be a supporting record attached to the will. He glanced over it briefly before placing it on the desk beside the main document. It was a small moment, barely noticeable, but something about it caught my attention. The paper looked slightly newer than the others. Most of the documents on the desk had the faint yellow tint that comes from sitting in a file cabinet for months or years. This page looked bright white, like it had been printed recently. I did not say anything about it right away. Instead I watched the way Mr. Harris organized the documents while he continued speaking. Emily noticed the movement too. She leaned forward just a little and asked casually, "Is that the amendment Dad signed last year?" The question sounded simple enough, but it carried a very specific assumption. She was already identifying which document the lawyer was holding before he had explained anything about it. Mr. Harris looked down at the page again and nodded. "Yes, this is the supporting record that was filed with the revision." Emily smiled slightly and leaned back again. The moment passed quickly, and the meeting continued. But that small exchange stayed with me. The way she had identified the document so quickly made it seem like she had seen it before. Maybe she had. Maybe Dad had shown her everything. Still, the more I watched her reactions during that meeting, the more it felt like she was following along with a script that I had never been given. The lawyer continued explaining the administrative steps involved in settling the estate. He spoke about account transfers, tax documentation, and the timeline that usually follows after a will is read. Most of it sounded like routine legal procedure, but my attention had shifted completely now. Instead of listening to the technical details, I found myself replaying that one moment in my head. The moment Emily asked about the amendment before the lawyer had even explained what the document was. That question did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like confirmation. I leaned back in my chair again and glanced at the stack of papers on the desk. Somewhere inside those pages was the official version of my father's final wishes. But the more the meeting continued, the more I started to feel like the story surrounding those pages had already been carefully shaped before any of us walked into that room. And for the first time since the lawyer began reading, a quiet thought crossed my mind that I could not ignore anymore. If Emily already knew exactly what was inside that document, then how had she learned it before the rest of us ever saw it? The longer I sat there listening to the lawyer explain the estate process, the more the quiet uneasiness in my mind started turning into something heavier. It was not anger yet. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize a conversation is moving in a direction that you never agreed to in the first place. Mr. Harris continued reviewing the documents calmly, but now I was paying attention to every small detail. The papers were spread neatly across the desk in front of him. The main will sat in the center, and the amendment page that Emily had mentioned earlier was resting just slightly to the side. Every few minutes the lawyer would glance at it while explaining another part of the process. Meanwhile Emily sat there looking completely relaxed, like someone who had already rehearsed this entire meeting in her mind before we ever arrived. I finally decided to ask the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. I kept my voice calm when I spoke because the last thing I wanted was for the conversation to turn into some emotional argument in front of our mother. I said, "Emily, when did Dad show you that amendment?" She turned her head toward me slowly. Her expression did not change much, but I could see a flicker of irritation pass through her eyes before she answered. "Ryan, we talked about it months ago," she said. Dad wanted to make sure I understood what he was planning. Her answer sounded smooth, but it did not actually explain how she had known the exact document sitting on the desk earlier. Mr. Harris looked between us for a moment, clearly aware that the tone in the room was starting to shift. He adjusted his glasses again and tried to steer the conversation back toward the legal details. It is not uncommon for family members to discuss estate planning in advance, he said politely. Your father may have simply explained the structure before the paperwork was finalized. Emily nodded immediately as if the lawyer had just confirmed her story. She said, exactly. Dad did not want any confusion later. The way she spoke made it sound like I was the only person in the room who did not already understand the situation. I leaned back in my chair again and looked at the stack of documents on the desk. Something about this entire conversation felt carefully managed. Every time I asked a question, Emily responded in a way that made it sound like everything had already been settled. Months ago. Meanwhile, I was hearing most of these details for the first time. The lawyer continued explaining how the executor would manage the financial accounts over the next several months. Emily asked a few technical questions about the process, things like how quickly the business accounts could be transferred and when the company vehicles would officially change ownership. The questions were practical, but the timing of them felt strange. It sounded less like she was learning about the process and more like she was confirming steps she had already planned. My mother listened quietly as the two of them discussed the logistics. At one point she said softly, Emily has been handling so much already. I am glad someone understands how all of this works. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because Mom meant anything negative by it, but because it showed how the situation was slowly shaping everyone's perception of the family dynamic. Emily was the responsible one who stayed close to home. Emily understood the business. Emily had been there during Dad's final months. Without anyone saying it directly, the implication was becoming clearer with every passing minute. I was the one who had moved away. I was the one who had not been present for the daily conversations. And because of that, it was starting to feel like I had less of a voice in decisions that affected my own father's legacy. I noticed Emily glance at me again after Mom spoke. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet firmness behind it now. She said, Ryan, I know this might feel sudden for you, but Dad and I spent a lot of time talking about how to protect the company. He wanted someone who understood the details running things. There it was again. The same message she had been repeating in different forms since the meeting began. Stability. Protection. Responsibility. Every version of the story placed her at the center of those ideas. I folded my hands together on the table and looked back toward Mr. Harris. Can I see the amendment page for a moment? I asked. The lawyer hesitated slightly before sliding the document across the desk toward me. The paper felt smooth and crisp under my fingers when I picked it up. The text described a revision to the estate structure that adjusted how the business would be managed after my father's death. I read through the wording carefully. Most of it was written in the same formal language that lawyers always use, but one line stood out clearly. The amendment gave the executor expanded authority over company operations until the estate settlement was complete. I slowly placed the page back on the desk. On the surface it still looked like a reasonable administrative decision. But the more I thought about Emily's earlier comments, the more a quiet realization started forming in my mind. My sister had not just been answering questions during this meeting. She had been guiding the entire narrative from the beginning. Every explanation she offered seemed designed to lead us toward one conclusion. That she was the natural choice to control everything connected to the company. The lawyer gathered the documents together again and prepared to continue reading the remaining sections of the will. But as I watched Emily sitting across the table from me, perfectly calm and confident in the story she had been presenting all morning, I could not ignore the growing suspicion that something about this document might not be as simple as it appeared. The room had grown noticeably quieter by the time Mr. Harris gathered the documents again and prepared to continue reading the final sections of the will. I could feel the tension sitting right beneath the surface now, even though nobody had raised their voice or said anything openly confrontational. Emily remained calm across the table from me, her posture relaxed, her hands folded neatly again as if she had returned to the exact same position she started the meeting in. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reviewing the remaining legal language in the document, explaining how the executor would oversee the company operations until the estate was formally settled. I tried to listen carefully, but my mind kept drifting back to the small details that had begun stacking up over the past hour. The way Emily seemed to know what each page contained before it was even read. The way she had described the amendment earlier with such certainty. The way every explanation she offered slowly nudged the conversation toward one conclusion, that she was the only person who truly understood what our father wanted for the company. I glanced down at the papers again while Mr. Harris continued speaking. The amendment page was now sitting on top of the stack again, and for the first time I noticed something else about it that I had not caught earlier. The date printed near the bottom looked slightly darker than the rest of the text, almost as if the ink had been applied differently. It was a small detail, and maybe it meant nothing at all, but once I saw it I could not unsee it. I leaned forward again and asked quietly, "Mr. Harris, can you confirm exactly when this amendment was signed?" The lawyer looked up from the document, clearly surprised that I was focusing so closely on that particular page. He adjusted his glasses and checked the date printed at the bottom. "According to the document, this amendment was signed on April 17th of last year," he said. I felt a strange chill run through me when I heard that. April 17th. I remembered that week very clearly. It was the same week Dad had been admitted to the hospital for a series of tests. I had flown back to Columbus and spent 3 days with him during that visit. We talked about a lot of things during those days, including the future of the business. He had told me that he was proud of the company and hoped Emily and I would continue running it together one day. He never once mentioned signing any amendment to the will during that time. I looked across the table at Emily again. She was watching me now, her expression calm but slightly more guarded than before. It was the kind of look someone gives when they realize another person has started connecting pieces of a puzzle they thought were safely scattered. I spoke again, keeping my voice steady. "That is interesting," I said. "Because I was here that week. Dad and I spent several days together at the hospital." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to show that my comment had landed somewhere she did not expect. "And?" she asked. Her tone was polite, but the tension underneath it was becoming easier to hear. I glanced back at the amendment page sitting on the desk. "And he never mentioned signing any revision to the will during that visit," I said. The words hung in the air for a moment. Mr. Harris looked down at the document again, clearly realizing that the conversation had taken a turn he had not anticipated when the meeting began. Emily leaned forward slightly now, her calm confidence starting to shift into something more defensive. "Ryan, Dad did not need to explain every detail of his estate planning to you," she said. "He talked to me about those decisions because I was here helping him with the business every day." The explanation sounded familiar because it followed the same pattern she had been using throughout the entire meeting. Responsibility. Proximity. Control. But this time something about it felt weaker, like a line that had been repeated too many times. I did not respond right away. Instead I looked back at Mr. Harris. "When someone signs an amendment like this," I asked slowly, "do you usually keep the original signed copy on file?" The lawyer hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, we keep an archived copy of every signed document in our records," he said. That answer made my heartbeat pick up slightly. Because if the archive existed, then the amendment sitting on the desk was not the only version of that document. I leaned back in my chair again and glanced at the page one more time. The darker ink in the date. The crisp white paper compared to the older pages underneath it. The growing list of details that had seemed insignificant at first. Emily noticed where my attention had landed, and for the first time since the meeting started I saw something new in her expression. Not confidence. Not calm. Something closer to concern. Mr. Harris slowly reached for the amendment page again, studying it more carefully now that the questions had been raised. The room fell completely silent while he examined the document. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than before. And as I watched the lawyer's eyes move across the page, I had the strange feeling that we were only seconds away from discovering whether the story my sister had been telling all morning was actually built on something real, or something that had been quietly rewritten long before any of us walked into that office. Mr. Harris kept his eyes on the amendment page for several seconds, and in a room that quiet those seconds felt unusually long. No one spoke. My mother looked back and forth between the two of us, clearly sensing that the meeting had shifted from a routine reading of the will into something far more serious. Emily sat very still now. The confidence she had carried earlier had not disappeared completely, but there was a new tension in the way her shoulders held steady. Mr. Harris slowly set the amendment page down on the desk again and folded his hands together. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded more cautious than it had at any point earlier in the meeting. He said, "I would like to verify something before we continue." Emily immediately leaned forward. "Verify what?" she asked. Her tone was controlled, but there was a sharpness behind it that had not been there before. Mr. Harris glanced briefly at the document again before answering. "The amendment itself appears to reference a supporting signature record that should exist in our archive," he explained. "I would like to compare this version with the copy we have stored in our files." The moment those words left his mouth, the air in the room changed. I noticed Emily's fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the table. It was a small movement, but it was the first clear sign that the calm control she had maintained all morning might be starting to slip. "That is not necessary," she said quickly. "Dad signed the amendment. We already talked about that." Mr. Harris remained polite, but his expression had grown more serious. "I understand," he replied calmly. "However, when questions about document timing come up, it is standard practice to confirm the archived copy." He stood up from his chair and walked toward a filing cabinet along the back wall of the office. The cabinet was one of those tall metal ones that law offices seem to have everywhere, filled with decades of records. While he searched through the folders, the silence between Emily and me became heavier. I could feel her watching me now. When I finally looked back at her, the expression on her face had changed. It was not anger exactly, but it was no longer the relaxed confidence she had shown earlier either. "Ryan," she said quietly, "I do not understand why you are making this complicated." I kept my voice calm when I answered. "I am not trying to make anything complicated," I said. "I am just trying to understand how Dad made a change during a week when I was sitting with him in the hospital and he never mentioned it." She shook her head slightly. "Not every conversation he had needed to include you," she replied. The answer followed the same pattern she had used all morning, but the delivery felt more strained now. Before either of us could say anything else, Mr. Harris returned to the desk holding another document. This one looked older than the amendment page we had been examining. The paper had that faint yellow tint that comes from sitting in a file cabinet for months. He placed it beside the document that had been on the desk earlier and adjusted his glasses again as he began reading. "This appears to be the archived copy of the amendment signed on April 17, he said. He studied both pages side by side for several moments. I watched his eyes move slowly across the text, comparing the lines carefully. Emily leaned forward again, her voice tight now. "They are the same document," she said. "Dad signed it. I was there." Mr. Harris did not respond immediately. Instead he pointed gently to the bottom section of the page. "The structure of the document is similar," he said carefully. "However, there is a difference in the final paragraph." He slid the archived copy slightly closer to us so we could see it. The paragraph describing the executor's authority looked almost identical to the version we had been reading earlier, except for one critical detail. In the archived copy, the authority granted to the executor was temporary and limited to administrative responsibilities during the estate settlement. In the version that had been sitting on the desk earlier, the language gave the executor expanded operational control of the company. The difference was only a few lines of text, but the meaning behind those lines changed everything. I felt my chest tighten as the realization settled in. Emily stared down at the 2 pages for several seconds without speaking. "That does not make sense," she finally said. Her voice sounded quieter now, almost uncertain. Mr. Harris shook his head slowly. "The archived copy is the version your father signed in this office," he explained. "The wording here matches the official record filed with the estate planning documents." He lifted the other page slightly. "This version appears to have been altered." The room went completely still. My mother looked up from the table with confusion written across her face. Emily's calm composure finally cracked. "That is not possible," she said quickly. "Dad wanted me handling the business." Mr. Harris did not argue with her, but his tone remained firm. "Your father did appoint you as executor," he said. "But the archived document does not grant expanded operational control of the company." I leaned back in my chair and watched the scene unfold. The quiet certainty Emily had built throughout the entire meeting was unraveling piece by piece in front of everyone. The story she had been guiding us toward all morning depended on the wording in that amendment. And now the original document sitting on the desk showed something very different. For the first time since the meeting began, my sister looked like someone who had lost control of the narrative she had spent weeks carefully constructing. For several seconds after Mr. Harris finished explaining the difference between the 2 documents, no one in the room said anything. The silence felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that morning. My mother looked from the archive page to the other version of the amendment as if she was trying to understand how 2 pieces of paper that looked so similar could carry completely different meanings. Emily remained leaning forward over the desk, staring at the documents without blinking. The calm confidence she had carried into that meeting had completely disappeared now. Mr. Harris gently gathered the 2 pages and placed them side by side again, making sure we could all see the differences clearly. He spoke slowly and carefully, the way someone does when they know the truth they are explaining will change the direction of a family conversation forever. He said that the archived copy represented the legally recorded amendment signed by my father inside that very office. That version confirmed that Emily had been appointed executor of the estate, which meant she would help manage the administrative process while the estate was being settled. But it did not grant her permanent operational control of Carter Building Services. The business itself, according to the official document, remained part of the estate that would ultimately be divided equally between the heirs. Hearing those words felt strange. Not because I had ever wanted more than my sister, but because the entire story Emily had been presenting all morning suddenly collapsed under the weight of that explanation. My mother slowly leaned back in her chair as if she needed a moment to absorb what had just been revealed. She looked toward Emily with confusion rather than anger. "Emily," she said quietly, "did you know about this difference?" My sister finally lifted her eyes from the papers. For the first time that morning she looked uncertain. Her voice was much softer now when she spoke. She said that she believed the amendment gave her the authority to protect the business the way Dad wanted. She said she had spent months helping him manage the company when he was sick, and she thought he trusted her to continue doing that after he was gone. It was not a dramatic explanation. It sounded more like someone trying to hold together a story that had started falling apart. Mr. Harris remained professional as he explained that the wording in legal documents must match the archived records exactly. Any altered language would not carry legal authority unless it had been officially signed and filed. The version sitting on the desk earlier, the one that gave expanded operational control, did not appear in the official archive. That meant the estate would follow the terms of the original signed document instead. Emily did not argue with him after that. She simply leaned back in her chair and stared down at the table. The tension that had filled the room earlier slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of reality settling into place. Mr. Harris continued reading the remaining sections of the will, explaining that the business, the financial accounts, and the remaining property would ultimately be divided equally between Emily and me after the estate settlement process was completed. My mother would retain the house for as long as she wished to live there, exactly the way my father had always promised. Listening to those words felt strangely familiar, almost comforting. It matched the conversations my father and I had shared over the years. Fairness had always been important to him. The meeting ended not long after that. Mr. Harris explained the next legal steps and said he would begin the formal settlement process using the archived documents as the official record. My mother thanked him quietly, and we slowly gathered our things from the table. Emily remained silent while we walked out of the office building together. The sky outside was still gray, the same heavy Midwestern clouds hanging low over the city. For a few moments none of us spoke. Eventually my mother got into her car and drove home, leaving Emily and me standing in the parking lot. She looked at me briefly before speaking. Her voice was calm again, but it carried a tired honesty that had not been there earlier. She said that during Dad's final months she felt responsible for keeping everything together. The business, the hospital visits, the bills, the uncertainty of what would happen after he was gone. Somewhere in the middle of that pressure she convinced herself that controlling the company was the only way to protect what Dad had built. I listened quietly while she spoke. Looking back now, I realized that moment taught me something important about family conflict. Sometimes people do not start with bad intentions. Sometimes they slowly cross lines because they believe they are protecting something that matters to them. The difference between belief and truth, though, has a way of revealing itself eventually. The documents inside that lawyer's office did not care about anyone's assumptions or expectations. They simply reflected what my father had actually chosen. And in the end, the truth that came out of that quiet room was the same truth my father had always told us growing up. Everything would be split down the middle. Fair and simple. Just the way he believed it should be.